I was 65 when my world split in two. The day my father's will was read, my brothers walked out millionaires, laughing, hugging, promising family dinners that would never happen. I walked out with a dusty brown envelope. No words, no explanation, just an envelope that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in decades. Everyone in that room thought it was some cruel joke. So did I, until I opened it. What I found inside wasn't money. It wasn't property. It wasn't even something I could sell. But it changed everything. The way I saw my family, my father, and the man I used to be. My name is William Carter, and this is the story of how losing $18 million led me to the darkest and most liberating a chapter of my life. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and polished wood. Sunlight leaked through half-closed blinds, falling across a row of fake plants that had seen better days. My brother sat across from me, Eddie in his designer suit, tapping on his phone like he was closing another deal, and Mark, quiet as always, pretending he wasn't sweating through his shirt. I sat there with my cane propped against the chair, staring at the folder on the lawyer's desk. It had my father's name on it, Harold Carter, a man who built half the town, who owned more land than anyone I knew, and who managed to die without saying a word to me for the last 7 years of his life. When the lawyer started reading, the words rolled by like static. To my son Edward Carter I leave. To my son Mark Carter I leave. Each time the numbers grew heavier. 2 million, 6 million, 10 million, and then came my name. To my son William Carter. The lawyer cleared his throat. I leave one sealed envelope, contents known only to myself. That's it. No explanation. No apology. No reason. I heard Eddie chuckle. Guess Dad still thought you were the sentimental type, he said, flashing that corporate smile that had always made me want to put my fist through it. Mark tried to look sympathetic, but I could see the relief in his eyes. He was just glad it wasn't him. When the meeting ended, I picked up that envelope. The paper was rough, stained, corners frayed. My father's handwriting, shaky but still sharp, crawled across the front. For William. When I'm gone, I didn't say a word. Just walked out. Outside, the air smelled like rain and gasoline. My old Ford pickup was parked under a flickering streetlight. I sat inside for a long time, the envelope in my lap, listening to the hum of traffic and the soft crackle of an old country song playing on the radio. $18 million. Split between two men who hadn't even visited him in his final months, and me, the son who stayed behind, who took him to appointments, fixed his roof, changed his oxygen tanks. I got paper. I wanted to tear it open right there, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride. Maybe fear. Maybe the voice of my father still somewhere in the back of my head, telling me not to rush things. So I drove home. The drive took 40 minutes through empty roads and dying cornfields. My house sat at the end of a long dirt lane, the same one my father built back when gas was 30 cents a gallon. When I stepped inside, the silence hit me. My wife had passed 3 winters ago, and the place hadn't been the same since. I sat down at the kitchen table, poured a drink, and stared at that envelope. For a moment, I thought about all the ways I could spend $18 million, pay off debts, travel, maybe buy that cabin in Montana I used to dream about. But instead, I had this. When I finally opened it, the smell of old paper hit me first. Inside was a folded letter and a small black key taped to it. The letter said, "If you're reading this, it means I've gone. You won't understand now, but I did what I had to do. There's a box buried where you and I built the barn in '73. Use the key. You'll find what you're owed." Dad, I read it twice, then again. A box buried? After all these years? At first I laughed. Then I didn't, because my father wasn't the type to joke. And something about that note, the way it was written, the precision of it, made my hands shake. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just kept thinking about the box, the key, and what he meant by what you're owed. I'd spent my life working under that man's shadow. Now he was gone, and somehow he still had one more lesson and a trick waiting for me. At 5 a.m., I packed a flashlight, a shovel, and a thermos of black coffee into the truck. The sky was just turning pale when I drove toward the old family farm, the place I swore I'd never go back to. But something told me that envelope wasn't just a joke. It was a message, and whatever was buried under that barn was going to change everything. The old Carter barn looked exactly like it did the day I walked away 20 years ago. Half the paint gone, wood dry as bone, the roof sagging in the middle like an old man's spine. Morning fog wrapped around the fields, and every step I took crunched through frozen grass. The air was colder than I expected for early spring. Or maybe that was just me, cold from the inside out. I parked the truck near the fence, grabbed my shovel, and stood there for a long time just looking at that place. Every corner of it held a memory. Me and Dad hammering nails when I was 10, him yelling when I bent a nail sideways, us laughing later when the rain poured through the gaps we never fixed. Now it was just me. Him and those memories buried under the dirt. The letter said where we built the barn in '73. That meant the south side. The dirt there was packed hard. I walked around, kicking the ground, trying to remember where we laid the first beams. My knees ached, my breath came out in fog, but I started digging anyway. For an hour, nothing. Just roots and rocks. I cursed under my breath, thinking maybe it was all some sick joke. Maybe he wanted to send me chasing ghosts while my brothers drank champagne with their new fortunes. Then my shovel hit something solid. It made that hollow clunk sound, metal against metal. I froze. I cleared more dirt, heart pounding. A small rusted box began to appear. It was about the size of a shoebox, edges corroded, a padlock hanging on the front. The key from the envelope fit perfectly. When I turned it, the lock gave a tired little click. I opened the lid, expecting, I don't even know what. Gold documents? Some hidden stash. But inside were just papers. Dozens of them bundled with a faded leather strap. Old receipts, property records, hand-signed contracts with names I didn't recognize. At first, it made no sense. Then I saw a name that made my stomach drop. Edward Carter. One of the papers was a loan contract dated 1993. It showed Eddie had borrowed $500,000 from my father's company, money he never repaid. Another one, dated 1999, showed Mark selling land to my father for far less than it was worth, then taking the cash back under the table. My father kept everything, every secret, every betrayal, and there near the bottom was a folder labeled Insurance Claim 2004. I pulled it out. Inside were photos I'd never seen before, charred remains of a warehouse fire, police reports, and an insurance check for $2.3 million made out to Carter Brothers Logistics, Inc. only. Here's the thing. That fire wasn't an accident. I'd worked that warehouse. I remember the day it went up in flames. Dad told me it was a wiring issue, but the report said suspected arson, and the signature on the claim check? It wasn't my father's, it was Eddie's. My hands shook so bad I had to sit down. I looked out across the field, the morning sun creeping through the fog. All those years I thought I was the failure, the son who never made money, who didn't get it. Turns out my brothers weren't businessmen. They were thieves. My father must have known. That's why he gave me the envelope. I wasn't supposed to get the money. I was supposed to get the truth. At the bottom of the box was one more thing, a cassette tape. Labeled in my father's handwriting, "Play this when you're ready." I stared at it, feeling the weight of those words. When I drove back home, the roads blurred by. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, mind racing. I still had an old cassette player in the garage. The second I pressed play, his voice filled the room. "Will, if you're hearing this, it means the boys got what they wanted. But I couldn't leave them with clean hands. You were always the only one who cared about this family. You deserve the truth. The money they took, it isn't theirs. It's dirty, and one day they'll have to answer for it. I need you to decide how, son." There was a long pause. Then softly, "This isn't about revenge. It's about balance. If you want to do the right thing, everything you need is in that box. You'll know where to start." The tape clicked off. I sat there for hours staring at that box. The papers weren't just records, they were evidence. Enough to destroy Eddie and Mark's entire empire. And right then I realized something I hadn't felt in years. Power. For 2 days I didn't leave the house. Didn't eat much either. Just sat in my kitchen with that metal box in front of me. The papers spread out like a puzzle I was too scared to finish. $18 million. That number kept circling in my head. My brothers had it all. Houses in Florida, shiny new cars, fake smiles on magazine covers. And me? I had arthritis, an old pickup, and a box full of ghosts. But for the first time in years, I wasn't angry. I was focused. See, revenge isn't about rage. Rage burns fast, leaves nothing behind. What my father left me wasn't just evidence, it was control. A chance to decide what justice looked like. I started small. I took one of the documents, a signed loan record, and scanned it into my computer. I didn't even know if the old scanner still worked. But when that image appeared on the screen, clear as day, I felt something tighten in my chest. Proof. The next morning, I called an old friend, Charlie Benson. We used to work together back when I still ran one of Dad's warehouses. He'd gone into journalism later, worked for a local paper before he retired. Charlie was the kind of man who could smell a lie from a mile away. When he picked up, his voice cracked with surprise. Will Carter? Damn, haven't heard that name in a while.
You still alive, old man?
Barely, I said. Listen, I need to talk. It's about Eddie and Mark. The tone in his voice changed instantly. What about them? Not on the phone. You still live near Franklin? He did. I drove there that afternoon. Charlie's house smelled like cigarettes and coffee. He had stacks of newspapers everywhere, a half-broken typewriter on his desk. When I handed him the folder of documents, he went quiet. After 20 minutes of reading, he looked up. Jesus, Will, this stuff could bury them. I don't want them buried, I said. I want them exposed. He nodded slowly. You sure about that? Once this comes out, the FBI will get involved. These aren't small-time crimes. This is fraud, arson, tax evasion. Hell, there's a forged signature from a state inspector here. I didn't answer right away. Outside, rain started tapping against the windows. I thought about my father's voice on that tape. This isn't about revenge. It's about balance, I'm sure, I said finally. They stole from him. They stole from me. They stole from everyone who ever trusted them. Charlie leaned back, sighing. You realize your name's in some of these contracts, too. They'll drag you into it. I'll take that risk. For the next week, Charlie and I went through every page. We built a timeline, found matching public records, traced money transfers through shell companies I never even knew existed. My brothers had built their empire on ashes, and I finally saw how deep the rot went, but I wasn't ready to hand it all over yet. Something in me wanted to see their faces first, to look them in the eye one last time before it all came crashing down. So I called a family meeting. I told them I wanted to make peace, said I was ready to move on. Mark sounded hesitant. Eddie, as usual, was arrogant. Sure, Will. Dinner at my place Friday night. I'll have the chef prepare something special for the prodigal son. I could almost hear the smirk through the phone. That Friday, I drove to his mansion outside the city. Marble floors, glass walls, the kind of place that screamed wealth. He greeted me like we were old buddies, pouring whiskey I couldn't afford if I sold my truck twice. Mark sat quietly at the bar, avoiding my eyes. I took a slow sip and set the glass down. You boys did good, I said, forcing a smile. Dad would be proud, Eddie laughed. Well, we learned from the best. You just didn't learn enough. That was his mistake, and underestimating me, same as always. I looked at him calm. Yeah, maybe. But Dad left me something you two didn't get. Eddie frowned. What, his old watch? I shook my head. No, the truth. Before they could say anything, I placed a small flash drive on the table. Everything you've done, the loans, the arson, the fake insurance claims, it's all here. Dad kept it. He knew. Mark went pale. Eddie's jaw tightened. You're bluffing, he said. I stood up. Check your email tomorrow morning. You'll see, and then I walked out. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with the old tape playing again and again. My father's voice kept looping in my mind. You'll know where to start. By morning, I'd made my choice. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to ruin them. But I wasn't going to do it with hate. I was going to do it with precision. I learned early on that people who build empires on lies have two weaknesses: arrogance and routine. They think they're untouchable because they've always gotten away with it. They get lazy. They forget the small things. They forget the people they stepped on. That's where I started. I didn't want fireworks. I didn't want confession videos or a dramatic confrontation on social media. Those things make for headlines, sure, but they don't break a man's bones. I wanted slow, surgical collapse. Paperwork, phone calls, tired investigators knocking on marble stoops, accountants uncovering things that didn't add up. I wanted the kind of quiet that goes on for months, the kind that eats away at a man's confidence until he has nothing left but a name and a list of liabilities. Charlie was my first move. He still had a nose for a story and just enough contacts left in places that mattered: a state reporter, an investigator at the county courthouse, an ex-prosecutor who'd gone back to private practice but kept his old card in a drawer. We started with the paper trail. Every forged invoice, every suspicious transfer, every insurance claim that didn't match the fire reports. We organized it. We cross-referenced dates, names, signatures. There were gaps they couldn't explain. There were signatures that didn't match the official handwriting database Charlie somehow still had access to. Small things, but when stitched together, they formed a pattern. Next, I played the part my father had always dismissed me for, the patient's son. I kept showing up at Eddie's office, at Mark's luncheon, at charity events where they loved to parade themselves as pillars of the community. I smiled and I listened. I paid attention to who they trusted, who signed checks, who opened the mail, who handled contractors. It was like rediscovering a chessboard where every pawn had a name. Then I called a man I hadn't spoken to in 30 years, Ramon Diaz, a retired fire investigator who had been on the original warehouse case. He'd always thought the fire looked wrong. I remembered him because back in the day he used to stop by the warehouse and tell me stories about how fires start, how they spread, how sometimes the truth hides in the smallest scorch marks. Ramon had moved away, but when I told him what I'd found in the box, the insurance papers, Eddie's signature, inconsistencies, he agreed to look again. He didn't want money. He wanted to get it right. Ramon showed up at my kitchen table with a creased jacket and a stack of old photographs. He studied the pictures for hours, his eyes narrowing. "They staged it," he said finally. His voice didn't shout. It just landed. The pattern of burns, the accelerant traces, whoever did it knew how to fake cause a fire. That check? It's the kind of thing arson investigators call a deliverable benefit. Someone profited, and profit points right to the person who insured it. He tapped the photo with a finger that trembled. If we can connect the transfers, the shell companies, the invoices that paid for cleanup, that's your smoking gun. We found our first labor in a small shell company Eddie had used as a pass-through. The company's filings were sloppy. A P.O. box, a nominee director who dissolved the corporation the same month the claim was filed. Those little suspicious moves are what men who think like businessmen ignore. Men who used to listen to their elders and learn patience spot them. Charlie wrote an anonymous tip to a state reporter he trusted, attaching a sanitized summary and a few redacted documents. The reporter called his source at the state insurance board. A quiet inquiry began. At the same time, I started seeding doubts where they belonged. In their boardrooms with their lenders, and in the ears of people who still respected my father's name. I didn't go in with accusations. I asked questions. "Did you see the inspection report on Building 7? I'd ask an old contractor. "What do your records say about the transfers to Carter Enterprises in '93? I made people uncomfortable enough that they started pulling files. People hate uncertainty more than anything. When someone pulls a file, they sometimes find things they wish they hadn't. Eddie noticed. He thought I'd lost my mind. He invited me to a meeting and tried to charm me back into being the forgotten brother. "Will, you're making a scene," he told me, leaning back in his leather chair like he owned gravity. "This is business. We can help you if you want a small piece." He smiled like a man offering a dog a scrap. I lied and said I was tired. I left with a notebook full of the names of people who handled the books for Carter Brothers Logistics. Their phone numbers, the little habits I'd picked up just by watching. A woman who took lunch at 1:15 precisely every day. A man who always left early on Fridays. Little things. Little access points. Then I used the oldest tool in the book, leverage through kindness. I called in favors from people my father had helped in secret. There's a way to repay a favor that doesn't cost a thing but costs everything to the man who wronged you. There was a former accountant, Janelle, who'd been quietly disgraced when she refused to sign off on a suspicious transfer and was forced out. She'd vanished after that, a ghost in the firm's history. I found her living in a small town 2 hours away, running a diner. I didn't threaten her. I brought her coffee and a worn photograph of my father and me. I asked her to tell me the truth. It took her half an hour and a lot of tears. She handed me a ledger she'd kept in secret, a little list of payments with initials that matched the ones in the box. We compiled the ledger with the papers. It made the picture uglier. It made it real. It also changed the math. The embezzlement wasn't a few scams here and there. It was systemic. It had been going on for decades. Every contract Mark signed at a discount, every cleanup after a suspicious fire, every off-book loan Eddie took. It all funneled back to the same group of men who had decided they were above law and family. The first official knock came on a Tuesday. I heard raised voices from the curb as two men in plain suits explained to a contractor that the state insurance board had questions. The contractor, who'd always taken Eddie's calls, started sweating. He pulled his files. He laid out invoices, receipts, canceled checks. Once a single vendor's records got subpoenaed, the dominoes began to fall. My brothers called me, together this time. Eddie's voice was sharper, like someone who'd been cut. "Who did this?" he demanded. "You tell me," I said, and I meant it. There was something satisfying about letting the process do the work. I would not be the hammer. I would be the attender of consequences. They accused me of tattling. They accused me of being jealous. They hinted at lawsuits and betrayal and old hurts. But behind their words was fear. They had that way of moving when people know the music is changing. Quick gestures, slick phrasing, false confidence. The press got hold of the first story, small, buried in a Tuesday morning feed. Charlie's writing was careful, a quiet piece about insurance inquiries and potential conflicts. It rattled the boardroom and set lawyers into motion. Eddie hired one of those lawyers who make their menacing look like an art form. Mark called our cousins and tried to drum up support. But by then the state had already opened files and the federal types were listening at the edges. I watched as their empire cramps began. Contractors stopped answering calls. Lenders asked for audited statements. The bank that financed one of Eddie's purchases froze a line for review. Mark had to put an asset hold on a parcel of land he'd planned to sell. Little things, but enough. Their cash flow faltered. Their people started whispering. Worst for him was the quiet humiliation. Eddie used to stride into rooms like he owned them. Now he stepped lightly, eyes darting for a friendly face, a familiar ally. He started cutting ties, firing folks who'd been with him for years, selling off small holdings at losses, canceling charity events he could no longer justify. Pride is a brittle thing. When it cracks, the sound echoes. I didn't celebrate. That wasn't the point. Each time a phone call went unanswered or a check bounced, I felt only an odd, hollow relief, like a man who's finally trimmed a cancer and is waiting to see if he'll live. My heart ached for what our family had become, men who learned to steal from their own blood and dress it up as business. There were nights I drove back to the barn and sat on the old steps. I'd played this long game because I remembered Dad's voice, that thin instruction to seek balance. The rusted box was under my bed at home now, but its contents had gone out into the world. Secrets have a way of catching light. Once light finds them, the shadows shift, and men who thought they were indestructible begin to look very, very human. The unraveling wasn't fast, and it wasn't pretty. It was tedious and bureaucratic and slow, but it was effective. I learned that the thing my brothers coveted more than money was control. As control slipped, everything else followed. And somewhere between the first subpoena and the first public headline, the man I once was, the one who took care of his father, patched a roof, and drank too much coffee at midnight, started to find a new shape. Not one built on riches, not one built on spectacle, just a quiet, terrible peace. They started pushing back. At first it was just words, thin, careful things that tried to pretend they weren't worried. Eddie called me bluff, then tried charm, then threats. He hired lawyers who dotted their letters with legalese meant to lull a man into giving up. Mark sent polite texts with veiled insults. When those didn't work, they started cutting corners in ways that told me they were scared. Phone calls at strange hours, a man loitering outside my grocery store, questions asked of neighbors who'd known me since I was a boy. I'd never thought myself a brave man. I'd always been steady, useful in small, honest ways. I fixed things. I showed up. That steadiness had become my armor. But when the quiet began, cars idling by my mailbox, the shadow that moved on my porch at night, I felt something else. The raw, old animal part of me that refused to be bullied. One night, after the rain had washed the dust from the road and left a cold smell across the fields, I woke up to the sound of scraping, soft, like someone testing a lock. The house is old and noises live in its bones, but this was foreign. I reached for the lamp and listened. There it was again, the faint metallic rasp of a hand on the back door. I didn't call the police right away. I thought of Eddie and Mark and what men like them hire when they want something taken. I thought of the box, tucked in the closet under winter coats, its papers wrapped in a grocery bag. I thought of the cassette in Dad's voice. I thought of the ledger Janelle had given me and the way her hands had trembled when she slid it across the table. I should have called someone. Maybe I should have called Charlie. Maybe I should have called Ramon. Instead, I grabbed my old hunting jacket, the one with the faded inside pocket where I kept small tools, and quietly padded toward the kitchen. The light from the street lamp slid in through the curtains and painted the counters silver. I moved like I remember moving at 20, light, deliberate. Age dulls a man's speed, but not his caution. When I pushed the back door open, the porch light found a man hunched at the steps, a hoodie pulled up, gloves on. He froze like a rabbit caught with its nose in a trap. We both stared at each other for a long, slow breath. He had a thin face, someone younger than my son's, hands shaking. There was a bag at his feet, one of those nylon grocery sacks that crinkle like dry leaves. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He blinked. His voice was small. "I was told there'd be cash. I can make this quick." That word, cash, made something hard in me click. They thought they could buy people to do their dirty work. They thought their money could erase fingerprints and souls. "You got a name?" I asked. That sounded more like a father than a vigilante, but it was the only voice I had that morning. The hoodie trembled. "Sam," he said. "Sam Archer." I'd heard that name in connection with one of Eddie's smaller companies, a temp worker, disposable. A boy you'd hire to lift a crate and forget him the next month. He looked terrified. "You work for Eddie?" I asked. He swallowed. "No, I needed the money." He said it would be easy. There are moments when pity and fury fight in my chest. That night they were equal. I could have called the police then, had Sam arrested, spun the story of attempted burglary and hired hand. That would have been easy. But easy wasn't the lesson my father left me to teach. Besides, I wanted answers, real ones. "Who sent you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He looked at his hands. "It was Mark," he said. "He said if this all goes public, he'll lose everything. He said just get the box. He said he'd make it worth my while." The rain started again, thin and cold. I felt something old and bitter rise in me. Betrayal tastes like metal. They'd stooped so low as to hire young men desperate enough to risk prison for a few $1,000s. My brothers had gone from stealing from ledgers to stealing from the hungry. I didn't hurt him. I could have. Instead, I made coffee and sat him at the kitchen table. We talked for hours. I listened until his story was riddled with sobs and the little lies men tell themselves to sleep at night. I told him about Dad and the barn and the box. He cried sometimes, and I found that his tears were salt and truth. In the end, Sam agreed to do something that scared him more than the dark porch ever had. He agreed to talk to investigators and to tell them who hired him. He agreed to give a recorded statement. I drove him to the county station myself the next morning and sat in the waiting room until the officer led him away. Word moves fast where small towns and big crimes meet. The man who'd stood at my back door turned out to be the first crack in a shell that my brothers had thought was unbreakable. A few days later, a mid-level manager at Carter Brothers Logistics who'd been forced to sign off on invoices called Charlie and said he couldn't keep lying. An assistant accountant turned up a ledger she'd been asked to change and handed it to the state. Each small act of conscience felt like light leaking into a cellar, but it wasn't just legal pressure that weighed on them. There was the emotional toll, the way a man who loses control starts to claw at his own skin. Eddie began making mistakes on the phone. He attacked small things, a canceled contract, a missed payment. Mark started drinking in ways he hadn't in years. I heard from a neighbor that he'd gotten into a screaming match with his wife one night. Sound travels from big houses in a small town, their children pulled away. People who'd once been eager to be photographed with them suddenly had scheduling conflicts. I had to pay a price too. My name was dragged through gossip columns and sophisticated smear attempts, orchestrated by people whose entire job was to protect reputations with lies. They planted stories about me, about how I'd forged the documents, how I'd manipulated Dad, how I'd been the one with shady loans. There were anonymous emails to the state, to Charlie, whispering about a bitter brother. My mailbox filled with thin legal threats. A deep-set ache returned to my chest, the kind that had followed me since Mary died. The way grief makes you small and slow. Friends were cautious. Some didn't call. Others wouldn't meet my eyes, and yet through it all I felt steadier than I had in years. Maybe it was the work. Maybe it was the sense of finally doing something that mattered. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time since Dad's funeral, I wasn't walking blindly through the world. I had a path. I had choices. A week after the break-in attempt, Charlie called me from his old kitchen table, his voice low with something like awe. "Will," he said, "we have enough to put together a criminal referral. If we hand this to the U.S. attorney, they'll have to act." That was the moment I'd been circling toward without knowing it. It felt huge and frightening, the way standing at the lip of a cliff would. "One step and the world changes. I want them to feel it," I said. "I want the people who were hurt to know their names were cleared." Charlie hesitated. "You know what this means. Public trials, depositions, people digging into everything you've ever done." "I do," I said, "and I don't regret it." I thought of Dad's cassette, his voice telling me that this wasn't about revenge, balance, justice. When Eddie and Mark had grown fat off lies, my father had tucked a key and a tape into an envelope and left it to me to decide. Maybe he'd expected me to settle for less. Maybe he'd hoped I'd walk away. He'd been wrong about me twice. The next morning, I drove to the federal courthouse and asked to meet the assistant U.S. attorney who handled financial crimes. I left a sealed package on his desk. Copies of everything, the original cassette, and a note from an old man who'd had enough. The clerk took the package with a look that was equal parts curiosity and pity. On my way out, the courthouse steps felt like a stage. I put one foot in front of the other and let the wind carry me down. Behind me, beneath my jacket, the ledger was folded against my chest like a prayer. Tomorrow, the city would begin to learn what had been hidden in the dark for decades. Tomorrow, men who thought themselves untouchable would have to answer questions in rooms where the light hurts. I drove home slowly. The dirt lane smelled of summer rain and fresh earth. The barn stood silent and watchful. I climbed the porch steps and sat there until the stars crawled out, slow, indifferent witnesses. I reached into my pocket and felt the small weight of the cassette tape. For the first time since opening the envelope, I allowed myself to believe my father had left me something more than revenge. He'd given me a last choice, to be a man who finished what he started, not for the money but for the truth, and I'd chosen to finish. The courtroom smelled like bleach and old leather. Fluorescent lights hummed, and people shuffled like they were moving through a museum of consequences. I had never liked courthouses, not even as a kid when Dad dragged me to hearings and closed deals under the stern gaze of judges. This one felt smaller somehow because everything that had been built to look huge was thinning at the edges. Eddie and Mark walked in like they were still in charge, pressed suits. Expensive shoes, but there was a new weight to them. It sat in the slump of their shoulders, the way their eyes kept flicking to the gallery where friends and enemies had come to watch the fall. They weren't just fighting law anymore. They were battling the quiet, exacting machinery of public shame. The charges were stacked: insurance fraud, arson conspiracy, tax evasion, wire fraud. The prosecutor, sharp, 40-something, the kind of woman who didn't bother to smile, laid out the case like a surgeon listing steps. She showed records, calls, transfers. She played audio of confidential conversations. She called witnesses who'd once been willing to sign anything for a check. She called Ramon, who testified about the burn patterns. She called Janelle, who read her own ledger into the record and didn't cry. When they called my name to testify, my knees felt like someone had poured sand into them. I sat on that little wooden chair and looked at a room full of people who'd known me my whole life, and a handful who'd only ever known my brother's public faces. I felt exposed, but not in the way they tried to paint me in their smear campaigns. I felt honest, exact, full of the kind of conviction that comes when you've carried a truth for too long. "State your full name for the record," the clerk said. "William Harold Carter," I replied, my voice steady. They asked the usual questions: where I'd been, what I'd seen, how I'd come across the documents. I told them about the barn, about the envelope, about the tape. I tried not to let my voice tremble when I described the ledger Janelle had slipped me through a small diner window. I didn't embellish. I didn't gloat. I answered simply, because simple facts are harder to twist. Eddie's lawyer tried to paint me as a bitter brother, a man who wanted his share but was too late. He asked pointed questions about my relationship with Dad after Mom died, about the holes in my employment history, about my finances. I answered none of it with anger. There's a power in calm that people with a lot to hide find unnerving. The lawyer's eyes narrowed into the placid pool of a man who could no longer read a face. Outside the courtroom, reporters vied for sound bites. They wanted the moment when I'd snap, the moment when a patriarch's son turns vengeful. I gave them nothing. I told one reporter that the truth mattered more than drama. He looked disappointed. I tried not to care. The trial stretched on longer than I expected. Evidence that takes years to accumulate takes weeks to unravel publicly. Depositions ran into each other. New facts surfaced. An off-book payment to a political fixer. A ledger entry that showed a chain of shell companies stretching to an offshore account. Every week brought new names and new small betrayals. Mark's wife hired a high-profile PR firm and tried to salvage what she could. She appeared in one of those glossy magazine pieces about forgiveness and privacy, while the case was still open, and I watched her words on a screen and felt nothing but the brittle foreignness of someone trying to pretend everything could be neat. Families do strange things when their public persona is threatened. They put on costumes of calm and hope and wait for the storm to pass. Then there were the phone calls I didn't expect. Old friends, people who'd loaned me a belt when my truck broke down, who called to tell me they were proud. Men who'd stayed silent for years now wrote letters, telling me small stories about Dad, how he'd once paid to fix a neighbor's roof in the dead of a winter night, how he'd given away a mortgage payment to someone he thought might lose a house. Those stories reminded me why I'd kept the cassette and the box. My father had been a complicated man, but he'd also been capable of good in ways his sons never understood. Not everything went my way. The defense dug up things in my past, sad little things, old mistakes, and tried to show them as character flaws that undercut my credibility. I had left jobs suddenly. I'd married young and been left by Mary when the disease took her. They hinted that I had motives beyond truth. Every smear was a small hot pinprick. I felt them. Sometimes they stung enough to make me consider turning and running back to the barn where the dirt smelled honest. But every time doubt crept in, I replayed Dad's voice. Balance, he had said. Not revenge. Balance didn't mean cruelty. It didn't mean a public spectacle meant only to punish. It meant setting right what had been put wrong and letting whatever came next take its shape. Halfway through the third week, there was a development that neither Charlie nor I saw coming. A federal grand jury returned an indictment that included not only Eddie and Mark, but a handful of executives and former inspectors who'd signed off on things they never saw. The net widened into places we hadn't expected, banks that hadn't provided enough oversight, consultants who'd accepted checks too convenient to be coincidence. The ripple reached people whose names had been on the periphery for years. Eddie's face changed then. He went from composed anger to something raw and animal. He started making mistakes, late filings, forgetfulness during testimony, desultory outbursts when the prosecutor showed a photo of a burned warehouse beam and asked a simple question about a payment. He couldn't perform arrogance the way he used to. Mark, quieter, began to crumble in small, private ways. He missed a deposition because he'd been admitted to a hospital for exhaustion. He showed up to court with a hand that trembled and a voice that slid into apology when the judge asked if he understood the proceedings. There were moments I felt pity for them. Not enough pity to stop what we'd begun, but enough to feel the sting of how fragile people are under pressure. They'd convinced themselves the world was made to be taken. They hadn't considered what happens when the world resists. And then, in the middle of all that legal machinery, something else happened. Eddie called me. I almost didn't pick up. "Will," he said. His voice was a different instrument, thinner, without the usual polished edge. "Can we talk?" "Just you and me, no lawyers." He paused, then added, "Please." I looked down at the handset like it might burn. For a long time I said nothing. The offer could be a trick. It could be a plea. It could be a chance to finally see if there was a man who'd ever loved his family in him at all. "Meet me by the pier," he said finally. "Tomorrow noon." I hung up. I thought about it all night. The barn, the ledger, the way the world changes when lies unspool. I thought about Mary's laugh and about Dad's cassette and about the kind of man I wanted to be when it was all over. I went. The pier was empty except for gulls and a thin sheen of oil on the water. Eddie was already there, hands jammed in his pockets, looking smaller than his helicopter rides ever made him. He didn't apologize right away. He didn't offer to turn himself in. He said things that sounded like regret and then things that sounded like excuses. He blamed pressure, necessity, 100 small rationales that men use to justify huge betrayals. At one point, he looked at me with a kind of desperate honesty I'd never seen. "Will," he said, voice cracking, "I was wrong. I thought I had to protect us. I thought I could fix what I broke. I'm sorry." He stopped. The wind picked up and sent a seagull shrieking over the water. I listened. I saw the way his hands trembled. I saw Mark's pale face in his brother's eyes. I felt a movement in me that was equal parts anger and a kind of reluctant compassion. Forgiveness hadn't been on my checklist. Balance had. "Did you steal from Dad?" I asked finally. "Yes," he said. "We thought we were saving the company. We thought," he swallowed hard. "We were cowards." There it was, admission. Not the clean, neat confession I'd imagined, but something human and ragged. It did not absolve him. It didn't make the burned warehouses whole. It didn't return the money. But it made him accountable in a way a smug denial never could. We talked until the sun slid and the pier turned gold. He begged me to help him make things right. He asked me if there was a way to get mercy. I told him about the ledger, about the victims, about the men who'd lost retirement savings and families who'd suffered because of a claim that had been faked. When I left, the gulls wheeled and the water closed over our conversation like a lid. I knew things were far from over. The trial would continue. Sentences would be handed down. Some people would go to prison. Some money might be reclaimed. Some reputations would be ruined forever. But for the first time since opening the envelope, I felt something else. The possibility that confession might start a repair I'd once thought impossible. Not repair to what had been, but to what might be left standing. I drove home under an empty sky, feeling the weight of the coming days and the small, stubborn light that had kept me going. Chapter 7 was still unwritten, but I could see its edges, judgment, consequence, and finally, the quiet after the storm where a man decides who he will be next. The final verdict came on a cold Thursday morning. The courthouse smelled of coffee and anticipation, and the benches were filled with faces that had become strangely familiar over those long months. Reporters, old neighbors, investors, ex-employees, they'd all gathered to see how far the mighty Carters would fall. When the judge entered, everyone stood. My heart was steady, not calm exactly, but resolved. I had been through too much to shake now. Beside me, Charlie sat still, hands clasped, eyes forward. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The judge's voice was measured, almost weary, as if he'd seen too many families like ours. In the matter of the United States versus Edward Carter and Mark Carter. He paused, shuffled his papers, then continued. Guilty, on all counts. The words landed without music or triumph, just the dull weight of finality. Eddie didn't look up. Mark pressed his hands together and lowered his head. Their lawyers wrote something quickly, probably about appeals, but even they looked drained of hope. The sound that filled the room wasn't applause. It was the faint shifting of people who had been waiting years for honesty. Eddie was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Mark got 9. The others, the accountants, the fire inspector, the middlemen, took plea deals. The company was ordered to dissolve. The Carter name, once plastered on buildings and trucks across the Midwest, was officially finished. When it was over, I stepped outside into the chill. Reporters crowded near the steps shouting questions. I didn't answer. I just kept walking. There's nothing poetic about justice. It's paperwork, signatures, and silence. Charlie caught up to me in the parking lot. You did it, he said quietly. I shook my head. No, we did it. And Dad helped in his own strange way. He smiled. So what now? That question followed me for months. The first few weeks were chaos. Calls from lawyers, requests from journalists, letters from people who said I'd inspired them to stand up to their own families. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt tired, scraped raw, and older than 65. The farmhouse was quiet again. The nights were long, and sometimes I caught myself talking out loud, to Mary, to Dad, even to the brothers who'd betrayed me. The ghosts didn't answer, but the silence felt less empty than before. One evening, as spring edged in, I drove back to the barn. The air smelled of new grass and wet earth. The same wooden beams creaked above me, but the space felt lighter somehow, like it had exhaled. I climbed up to the loft where the envelope had once been hidden. The dust was gone now. I'd cleaned the place weeks earlier, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted it to feel alive again. I sat down and listened. To the quiet, to the world, to the faint echo of my father's voice that lived somewhere in my memory. He'd told me to find balance, not revenge. I hadn't understood what that meant until now. Balance wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. It was about finally letting go of the weight that had chained me to grief and anger for half my life. A few days later, I drove to the federal prison outside Des Moines. I hadn't planned to go, but something in me needed to see him, to end it properly. They led me to a small visiting room with plastic chairs and a metal table. Eddie walked in, thinner, quieter. The arrogance was gone. He sat down and looked at me. "You came," he said. "I did." He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Will, I know that's not enough, but I mean it." I studied his face. The lines there weren't just age, they were guilt, exhaustion, and something like peace. Maybe he'd finally stopped lying to himself. "I forgive you," I said. The words surprised me, but once they were out, I felt lighter. "Not for what you did, but for what it's cost both of us to keep hating." He swallowed hard, eyes glassy. "Thank you," he whispered. When I walked out of the prison, the sky was open and blue, the kind of blue that hurts to look at after a long winter. I stood there for a while, breathing it in. Months passed. I started fixing old things again, chairs, clocks, fences. Simple, quiet work. Janelle married a man who made her laugh. Charlie retired early and bought a cabin near the lake. Sometimes, on cool evenings, we'd sit there with a couple of beers and talk about the old days. One night, as the sun dipped low, Charlie turned to me and said, "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened? The envelope, the trial, all of it?" I thought about it. "Sometimes," I said. But then I remember, if it hadn't, I'd still be living in a lie. Maybe it was meant to happen. Maybe Dad knew I'd be the only one stubborn enough to open that envelope. He laughed softly. He knew you better than you think. Before leaving that night, I played the cassette one last time. Dad's voice filled the small room, soft and steady. "If you're hearing this, it means you found what I left. I never wanted to burden you, Will, but I wanted you to see who we really are, both the best and the worst. Don't let this destroy you. Let it free you." It did. By summer, I'd sold the farmhouse and moved to a smaller place near the coast. The mornings there are quiet, the kind where the world wakes up slowly. I take walks on the beach, fix things for neighbors, sometimes sit on a bench and watch the tide. The ocean has a way of teaching you something no courtroom ever could. Everything returns eventually. Secrets, guilt, forgiveness, all of it carried back and washed clean by time. My brothers took $18 million. I got a dusty envelope, and inside it I found the one thing money can't buy: peace. I'm 65 now, and most days start quietly. A cup of coffee, the sound of gulls outside my window, the slow rhythm of waves against the shore. Some mornings I forget about the trial, the fire, the lies. Other mornings the memories come back, clear as glass, but I don't flinch anymore. Sometimes I take that old dusty envelope out of the drawer, the same one that started it all. The paper's brittle now, the seal long broken. Inside it are the same few items. The photograph of Dad and me, a key to the barn, and a note in his handwriting that I must have read 1,000 times. When the truth costs you everything, pay it anyway. The debt's worth it. He was right. I lost my brothers, my inheritance, and the life I thought I deserved. But what I gained was heavier, deeper, the kind of peace that doesn't come from forgiveness alone, but from knowing you finally did what was right when it mattered most. The world doesn't remember the Carter name anymore, and that's fine. Maybe that's how it should be. But when I walk along the beach at dusk and the wind carries the scent of salt and rain, I swear I can hear my father's voice again, steady and proud, whispering through the noise of the sea. And I smile, because in the end, that dusty envelope didn't just change everything. It saved me.